In the upcoming lessons, we're going to be exploring how we can do a collision detection check. So that means that we're checking to see if one element overlaps another element. There's a formula that we're going to be using in order to make the check to see if there's an overlap. As well, within the lessons, we're going to be demonstrating how we can output certain values of the elements, also move two elements on the page using the keyboard. So it's going to be box 1 and box 2. Box 1 moves with the arrow keys. Once it has a collision with the element, the yellow element in the middle, that element is going to turn red. Once you move it out, it's going to go back to blue as well, or go back to yellow as well. The blue box can be moved with the arrow, with the keyboard keys, the letter keys, and once it has a collision with the box, that will turn it to the blue color. We're also going to be detecting collision between the two elements. So that's going to come up within the output area here saying hit true. We've got the formulas as they're being calculated for horizontal on both elements, both boxes, vertical on both boxes, as well as tracking the X, the Y, the width, and the height, which are going to be used in order to make the calculation to check to see if there's overlap between the elements. Collision detection is essential for making games and also for being able to check to see if there's overlap of elements that are moving within the web page, that are getting dynamic values for the X, Y coordinates, for the horizontal and vertical coordinates. It's going to be a step-by-step lesson covering all of the values and the formula used in order to make this calculation. We're going to be preparing for the collision detection, so we need to have two items on the page, as well as we need to be able to track their X, Y, their width, and their height in order to make the calculations for the overlap of the elements. They're both going to be the same size, so they're both 50 by 50, and one we can move with the arrow keys. So right now I'm pressing arrow keys on my keyboard, and the other one we're going to move with the A, S, Z, and W keys. So that gives us the ability to move each one of the elements, and we're updating the values of X, Y, width, and height of the elements in order to make the calculation or preparation for calculation for the collision detection. So that's coming up next. Let's go ahead and create an HTML file, and then within the HTML file we've got one div, which is our main container. Select that from JavaScript. So using the document and query selector to make a selection of the page elements from the web page, and that's going to be selecting the element with the class of container. We're going to be selecting it into an object called main, and then we can interact with the page element within our JavaScript code. So I've just output it into the console just to make sure that we do have it selected properly. Going over to the console, I've got the browser opened on the right hand side, and DevTools, so there's our element. It's selected, output into the console, ready to move on to the next part where we want to create some page elements. So we want to create a couple squares and move them and also track their coordinates into an output area. So let's create a function that can add some elements to the page, as we need to create several elements and append them into the main container. So the elements are going to need to have the parent that they're being appended to, the element type. So I just give a variable name within the parameters here of t, and let's create some elements. So creating an element, and this is going to be serving to output the message content, and we're going to be running the function adder. The parent for this element is going to be the main object that we just selected from the web page, and that's going to be the element with the class of container. And then here we need to select the type of element that we're creating, and this is going to be a div. So let's go ahead and within adder, we're going to construct the element. So using the document create element, and create an element using the string value that's passed into the variable of t. So this is going to create a div. You can also console log the element onto the page or into the console. So there's our div that we've created. We haven't added it to the page yet, and we can do that when we're doing a return. When we select the parent element that's coming from the function arguments, where we're passing in the object of main, and that's being referenced as parent, and we're returning the parent. And if we do an append child, that's actually going to return back the selected element. And the element that we want to append is contained within the element object ELE, and that's the one that we're seeing out here. So once we do this, we can then select, and within the console log, let's output the element that we've just created. So that's going to be the same one that we're referencing on line 8. And we're also outputting it into line 4. And if we go into the elements source code under the body within the container, there's the element that we've created. So now we've got a way to fairly easily create additional elements for the page. I'm going to get rid of some of these console messages because we don't use them or we won't need them anymore. So that's our main output area. And now you can also add in some content. So I'm going to set up another variable within the adder parameters to add in some HTML or some content there. And we can just put a value there of content. And within the element, since we've created the element, we can update the inner HTML of the element, and that can be coming from the argument within the adder function of HTML. So that will output the word content into the page. I also want to have a way to be able to add a class to it. So we'll add a class of output, and this will allow us to apply some styling to the elements to make them look different on the page. And we can do this with the class list and adding a class, and the class is going to be the element, the argument C that we're going to be passing in there. So that's going to be referenced as class of output. So we just add it in there, and it's expecting a string value. So now when we go back into the elements HTML, within the body, within the container, there's our newly created element with the class of output, the content of content, and that's going to be a div on the page. So we want to create a couple other objects on the page. I'm just going to update the view so that we can have it all within the visible area of the editor, and I can also keep the browser opened on the right hand side. So we want to create a couple boxes, and then these boxes are what we want to move around on the page. So we'll give it a value of box, and then the content here will just be box 1, and we'll create a second box. So now that we've created this adder function, this is going to give us an easier way to be able to add elements to the page. So we've got the couple boxes there. And I'm also going to update this to be output 1 and output 2. So they're going to track the coordinates of the boxes where they're located and allow us to move them out onto the page. So we've got the 2 content areas, and tracking, these are actually going to be tracking the coordinates of the various boxes, and then we want to apply the boxes to the page. Now I know they don't look like boxes, so this is where we can apply some styling to make them look more like boxes. Let's add, and we're going to just do the styling directly on the page. So within the page container, set the property for the position of this element. So this position is going to be relative, and that's going to allow us to add for the boxes the position of absolute and allow us to move them around within the main container. Also within the main container, we can do a background color. So set it at a fairly light background color so we can distinguish what we have for the main container. Let's set some sizes for the container. So set a width of 90 vertical width. Also for the margin, so auto margin, so that will center the content. And the minimum height of this, let's set that at 400 pixels. And maybe that's slightly a little bit too large, so maybe we'll downgrade it to about 300 pixels. So it fits nicely within the screen area. So now that we've got the boxes, let's set a width for the box to make them actually look more like boxes. So height for the box of 50 pixels. Let's set the position because they're absolute. So we can set a top and a left position. And we're going to move these with JavaScript. So right now they're going to be overlapping each other. I'm going to also do the line height and a line height of 50 pixels. So we'll center the content and text align to center the text aligned. So there's our boxes. We also want to maybe apply different colors to the boxes. So as we create them, we can update the style properties with JavaScript. So these are going to be custom for the different boxes. So setting up the background color, and maybe we'll make one red and we'll make the other one blue so that we can distinguish between them. And then we want to be able to move them on the page. So we're going to update their positions. So maybe for box 2, update the style position so that it's not right on top of box 1. and set the left position of that one to be at 100 pixels. So that gives us the two boxes on the screen. We also want to be able to add the content area. So let's update this, and we're going to have an area at the top where we can have the outputs. So this is going to be a separate div that's going to be sitting within main, and then within the main we'll create a second area that we can add content into. So let's setting it up, and now that we've got the function, so appending it to main, this is going to be a div. There's going to be no content in it, and this is going to be the top info area. So we'll set up a class of info on the message, and then these two output areas we're going to be adding into the info area on the page. And then the boxes, we'll set up a main area for the boxes, and I'll call it game board. And then using the adder, let's add that to the main parent. This is going to be a div. It's going to be no content, so just a blank content there, and then set up the class as game. Instead of adding the boxes to main, I'm going to update where I'm adding the boxes to, so the parent. So this is just a little bit of an update to where everything is going to be sitting on the page, and this way I can set the message area, which has a class of info, and I can make some updates to how that's going to be handled. So let's select the info area, and within the info area I'm going to set up a background color, and we'll set the background color to be white, add some padding around it of 5 pixels. Also, we'll do a text align, so we'll center align the text, font size, so make it slightly bigger, and save it that way. I also want to move down the main container, so we're going to select that and also select the game area, and that's going to be position relative. So that will move the boxes down, and for the game area I'll set the minimum width to be 300 pixels. So that way we've got the squares that are going to be sitting within that main game area, and we can move them around within there, and then we've also got the content information as messages at the top. So now we can add in the event listeners for the key presses, and we're going to be listening for key presses that are for each one of them. So allowing them to be able to move up and down, so we can update the positions, and then once we're updating the positions, we're also going to update the coordinates that are being output within the output area. So let's go ahead and add in the event listeners, and that's going to be added on the document. And using the add event listener, we're going to add an event for the key down event. So tracking key down, and whenever the key is pressed down, we're going to track the event object, and this is where we can get what key has been pressed down. And for now, we'll just console log out the key value, so it's going to be within the E code. So that's coming within the event object that's being passed into that function, and then we're just picking up that and getting the code value. And we're also going to create a second key, and this is going to be the key up. So this way we can track whenever the user presses a key, and also whenever the user releases the key. And then within the animation frame, then we can track which values have been pressed. So that's key A, key S, key W. So all of the key values are going to be listed out as we're selecting and we're clicking them. So depending on which ones we want to listen on, let's set up the key object. And this is going to be where we're tracking which keys are okay to be pressed. Because right now we're allowed to press any of the keys. So we want to restrict which keys are being tracked, and then within an object, track that key press information. So we're going to first start out by tracking the arrow keys, and that will be using moving the first box. So within the object, we can list out the property name, so it's going to be the left arrow key, and right now the default is going to be false on that. And the reason that I'm listing it out within the object is that way we can check to see if that key is within this object by using the property names. So there's all the different key values. So there's the arrow right. There's also going to be an arrow up and an arrow down. I'm just going to put spaces there so it'll move to the next line. And arrow down. So set all of those to false. And these are all going to be the keys that we're tracking. And now, so we're not tracking just every key that's pressed. We're going to check to see if the E code is in the object that we just created, and that's called the keys object. So if this value is within there, then only those keys are the ones that we're going to be tracking within the console. And we can do the same for the key up. So now let's try it, and I'm pressing various keys on my keyboard. Nothing is being tracked, but when I'm pressing the up, down, left, and right, those are being output into the console. So I can see that, and it's only those keys that we've got within the keys. So right now I'm pressing additional keys, and they're not being tracked within the object. So that's the effect that we want, because we only want to be listening for those particular key values. And once those are clicked, then we're going to just set the property to that key code. So using the keys object and then the bracket notation, we're going to be selecting the item from there and setting the value. So whenever the key is pressed, the object value is going to go to true. We don't need to track it into the console anymore. And whenever the key is released, then we're going to update that and set that to be false. So this will allow us to have the contents within the keys object, and depending on if it's true or false, then as we're looping through the animation frame, we're going to be able to detect what the user's actions are supposed to be. So whether we're moving the item or not moving the item. So let's create a function that's going to handle the update of the position. So I'll just call this function mover. And this is where we're going to run the request animation frame. And I'm going to set it up as a global game object. So create a global game object. And then this is where we can track the movement. And I'll just create a blank object called move. And we'll add in the animation frame within the game move object. And we'll make a request to it. So when the page loads, adding in the event listener for the window object, add the event listener, and when the DOM content loaded, then we're going to kick off the mover function. So the mover is going to right away get kicked off whenever the DOM content has loaded. And then within the mover, we're going to use the game move in order to request the animation frame. And the reason that I'm assigning a key value to it is that way we can also cancel the request animation frame using the key process. So setting up, and from the window object, get the request animation frame. And then the function that we want to run on the animation frame is going to be mover. So that's going to just kick off this function to run. And within the console, we're going to just output running. So there's the animation frame constantly running that console message. Just get rid of that. And now let's assign the movement of the page elements depending on if the keys are pressed. So we're going to check to see if the object value of keys, now we can use the dot notation or the bracket notation. So that's going to be the arrow right object. So if this is true, then that means that we want to update the position of the element on the page. Now I'm going to track these as variables. So we'll have the box 1, and maybe we can just call it x1 value. So right now that's going to be 0, and the x or the y1 value, and we'll set that to 0 as well. And select those, and we'll also get the y2 and the x2 values. So we can also set these dynamically where now that we've created the elements, so that's going to be coming from the box offset left value. And that's just a property that's on the element. So we got the box 1 offset left, And box 2, offset left, is going to be at position 100 because we've set that value there. So let's update that to box 2, offset left. So these values within the game object are going to match with where we've got the position of the elements. And this is going to be providing us a way to move the elements on the page. So now that we've got those, let's also set that for box 1 and offset top. Will give us the top position, which should be 0 for both of them. So those are 0, and then also offset top for box 2. So those are being set within the object dynamically, and now we can use those values to reset the position of the element as we loop through the mover function. So if the key arrow right is being pressed, then we're going to select from the game object the value, and let's also add in a speed value. So this is the speed that we want to move the elements at. And the reason I'm keeping it within the game object is that this is going to provide us a way to make it more dynamic. So we just have the one object and we can update all the properties. We don't have to go through the code to determine what properties we want to update. So we're getting the x1 value and we're going to increment it with the speed value if the button right is pressed. So within the game x1 property, which is currently going to be 0, we're going to add to it and update it using the game speed value. And we'll do the same for the other keys. So we've got an arrow left value. And for this one, we're going to decrease it by the game speed. And then we're going to do the 2 for up and down. So the arrow up, and that's going to affect the y axis. And then arrow down. So selecting y and y. So the arrow up, and that's actually should be decreasing. So let me update those. So down is increasing and up is decreasing. And we need to also update the position of the elements. So now that we've got the elements, we can select for box 1 style and update its left position. And the left position is going to be whatever the value of game x1 is going to be. And we also have to include the picks. I'm using the template literals, so those are the backticks to the left of the 1 key. And then just add in the picks value. So let's try it for the left and see if we can get some movement. So there's our box moving on the x-axis. Let's also select and we'll get the box moving on the y-axis. So that's using the top, and this is going to be using the y value for the picks. So I'm pressing arrow down, right, up, left. So that gives us the movement of the box. And we also want to be able to track that value into the output area. So let's select those values, and we'll track that within the output area. So we'll get the box on the left side plus the width of the box, and then we'll also output on the right side. So let's get the output. And first off, maybe we want to generate it separately. So create a value, I'll call it temp1. And this is just going to create a string value. And then within the inner HTML, I'll output temp1 into the output area. So we want to track some values here. And this is going to be the X for box number 1. So just can do box number 1 so we know which element we're tracking. And then here's where we can add in the game X1 value. And then the Y position is going to be the value of game Y1. So let's see how this updates. And as we see, we've got the different values for the X and the Y. We can also output the width of the element. So the width actually isn't going to be changing. And we know it's 50 pixels. But if we want to dynamically select the width of the element, and we're going to need this for the calculation. So let's add that in as an item within the object. So we're just going to select the X width, and that's going to be using the box 1 offset width value. And you can also see when you go into the console, the width is going to be 50% or 50 pixels. And there's also a height. So X height, and actually this should be X1 height and X1 width, so that we can distinguish and we can add in the other ones. So that's going to be under box 1 and offset. And again, you can see that property value, what that's going to come back as, which should be 50. So this is in case we change the dimensions of the box. We can still see the calculations as they're being output. Let's add in the other two. And I know this is turning out to be a rather large object, but we need all of these values as we're going to be tracking the properties of whenever we're getting the interaction. So that's going to be box 2. So actually, let me update this because this should be, and I'm actually going to change the property name. Instead of X1 height, we'll call it H1. And then this can be width 2. And update this to width 1. So it makes a little bit more sense where we've got the X1 at Y1, width 1, and H1 for the X position, so horizontal, vertical for Y, W for width, and H for height. And update this one as well. So that's going to just output those values, and then once we've created them, we can also update those values. And now these ones aren't going to be changing, but let's add them anyway so that we can see those values because we're going to need those within the calculation. And then the height of the elements. So that's W1 and H1. So there's our output for box 1. Let's create that, and we can also just move that to save us one line of code. We can just have it within the output of 1. And also now let's add it into the output of 2. So this is going to be box 2. So just update all of these numbers to be 2, and that's going to represent the second box. And I'll also update the colors of these elements, so they're going to match with what we've got for the box 1. So the style property and background color, and then we can also update the style property for output 2, and that will be blue. And for the info, I'm going to set the color to be white so that we see the text again. The red box moving, and I want to set to add to get the second box moving. I'm also going to add in a little bit more padding around the info areas so that we can distinguish between them, and selecting the info element and divs that are contained within the info, add in some padding around that and set that to be 5, and I'll update this to be 10. So that would give us a little bit more spacing, also make it a little bit easier to read the content within those boxes, make it slightly bigger as well. And within the box, let's set the color of the box elements to be white so that we can see the text that's contained within them. So now we've got the ability to move the box 1, but we don't have ability to move box 2. So let's add that in. And depending on what keys we want to use, we've already got the structure where we can set up and set the various keys that we want to track. So let's add it in and set the keys. So using the key A and then key W. And you can select any keys, so key S and then key D or key Z for false. So that will allow us to track those keys. And we don't have to change anything within the events because this will still function the same way. And then going down to where we're updating, we need to make some updates to the content. And this is all for box 1. So we can basically duplicate this content and set that for box 2 to do the movement. And it's got different keys, so let's track those keys. So the right key for this is going to be key S, and it's going to be selecting the second item, and the game speed is still fine. So let's do a quick update of these to make sure that we're getting the right elements, and this is going to be box 2. And now let's just update the keys. So the left key that we want to use is key A, the down key, so it's going to be key Z, and the up key is going to be key W. And now let's try that. So we've got, click on the element, we can still move the red, move the blue, and now we can move both boxes using the keyboard. So I'm making some keyboard presses, and which is allowing me to move the elements. We can also add in that we don't want to go outside of the borders of the main container. So just, and this is also maybe a dynamic value that we want to pick up for the container. So we want to output for the container, and the container is contained within the game board object. So when I get the width or the far right position of the element for the container, so we can do an offset width, which will give us the value of where the width is, and offset right. And try that first within the console. So for the game board, offset. So we've got the game board object, got the offset left position, which is 0. We also got the width, so that's 450, and that will actually change. So now that changes. So this is the value that we can see and we can use as the furthermost point on the right hand side, and the left hand side is going to be 0. So we need those two values where we've got the, we'll create an object and just call that dimension, or create an array, so that we don't have to create two separate items. And the first value within the array, so this is going to be the right hand side of the main container, and then the second one is going to be the bottom. So we can then use these to make sure that we're not running off the screen. So if we're going right, so we only want to go right if this game X value is still within the main dimensions. And that means that if it's less than the game board width, and that's going to be within the dimension 0. And we also have to account for the width of the box. So let's try that. And the reason that we need to account for that is that now we can still move right, but we get blocked and we're still passing the width. So let's subtract out the box 1, and we'll just use the 1. So we'll subtract out the box 1 offset width. So that will set the end of where we can go. And we need to also update and subtract out for the height as well. And to be exact, if right now both boxes are going to be the same height and width because they're getting it from the box element. But if you have two different size boxes, you're going to have to update this to be different. So now we're selecting and we're making sure that the game X is less than the dim, and that we make sure that it's greater than 0. Here it's making sure that Y1 is less than the value of the dimension 2, so that's the Y axis, the vertical axis. And here we're only going to go up if Y is greater than 0. And there's spelling mistake there within the height. So now it looks like we're able to move it within the parameters. And let's make an update of the other elements as well. So make sure that the right key, and that should be updated to be 2. We can use the same argument values, and we just need to update them to be the value of 2. And that way we're going to be able to restrict the movement, so that's within the main container area, and that we can't move outside of that. So now let's try it. We can't move outside, and trying the other element. So now we've got movement for both elements. I'm pressing the keyboard. We're tracking their positions. It's being output into the info area, and we're ready to move on to the next part where we can start working on the collision detection of the elements. So that's coming up next. So go ahead and set up your main interface where you can move the two squares, tracking the positions, the X, Y, width, and height in order to make the calculations for the collision detection, and you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson. This lesson, we're going to be going through how you can create collision detection within your JavaScript code. So a number of different ways, and we're going to be using a formula outputting the results for where box 1 and box 2 are added, and then also how you can have collision detection on different page elements accordingly. So now we can move box 1 whenever it gets over the avoid box and the yellow box in the center, that box will turn red. We can also move box 2, and whenever that one, the collision detection is detected, that will go blue. There's also a collision detection between the two boxes as they move, and when the collisions are detected, so we've got a collision detection on horizontal, collision detection on vertical for both of the elements, they go green when the collision detection is detected. And we also see that this result here being output is true, so we've got the X, the Y for both boxes, box 1 and box 2, and we also have the width and the height. So those are the values that we're going to need in order to determine and to calculate the collision detection. So that's all coming up in this lesson, where we're going to be explaining collision detection using JavaScript and moving DOM elements. Let's go ahead and add in the formula to detect for the collision detection. So we'll output and add in a couple other elements here within the info where we can have the box and then have the calculations using the formula for the collision detection. So we'll output that into the output area. So create a few other output areas and create a couple more. So this is going to be output 3 and output 4. And right now I'll just say content 3 and content 4. So those will be for those elements. Those will get appended to the page. So that gives us an area to work with where we can add the collision detection formula. So let's add that into the calculation where we're outputting, right now we're outputting the HTML, and we want to output the collision detection formula for box 1. So let's update that, and that can be 3 and that can be 4. Go back into the page, and then as we're outputting those contents, so for these elements, I want to set the color of them to be background color of black. So let's call this and set this up instead of output, we'll call it output 1 as the class, and then go back over here where we've got the elements that we're creating, and then add in output 1, and we'll set the background color. And we'll actually set it, we'll set the color to be black so that we can see the text that's being output in these elements. So that gives us those elements now being output, and we want to apply the calculations within the elements. So let's take the first one. I'll comment out the second one, so it's not going to be updating quite yet. And we want to add in the formula to detect for the horizontal. So for box 1, we've got a value of X. So let's put it into the formula, and the formula that we're looking for the X collision is going to be looking at the value of item number 1x, so 1x, so x1, and checking to see if it's less than the 2x plus the width of the 2, so 2 width. So that's going to be the formula to check to see if the one side has collision detection, and then the other side is going to be checking to see for the value of 1x, so it's the same value that we've got here, and we're checking to see if the 1x, and we need to calculate out the 1 width for that, and checking to see if this value is going to be larger than the 2. So that's going to be checking to see if that value is larger than 2x position. So that's what we're going to be outputting. So let's update these values. So we do have the calculations here for those elements. So let's update these, and this is going to be taking in the game 1x value. And we're going to see if it's less than the 2x value. So outputting the element number 2. And this is going to be checking for the horizontal collision. And we need to also get the value of game2 plus the width of the element. So that's going to be game xw2. And let's update this value. And checking to see if the value is going to be the w for element number 1, and then looking for the x value of element number 2. And we can remove out the rest of the content. So right now, this is where we're at, and this is going to be checking for the horizontal collision. And I'll make the text smaller within the output as we're tracking all of this information. So we don't want it moving to the next line as I'm tracking it. So now we've got all of those values are being updated, and we can see where those values are coming from up here. And these ones aren't changing, so we can actually do the calculation of those. And I'll output that to part number 3 or part number 4. So for output number 4. So this is going to be doing the calculation. So it's a little bit less confusing on how we're calculating this value. And then we're just going to be adding those together within the formula. So that's what we got for the output 4. So that's the calculated value for the elements with their width. So let's do the calculation for those. And for O3, so we'll check to see, so we'll put this formula in, and we'll see what gets returned back. So I'll grab the code and then we'll remove out the text content of it. So we've got the game x, and we're checking to see if it's less than the game 2 plus the part for the game 2 value. And this will just be the game 2 width in order to do the calculation. Let's add in the rounded brackets around that element. And then the other part of the formula is we're checking to see if the game 1 value is going to be plus its width is greater than the game 2 value. So this should return back a Boolean value. And let's output this Boolean value. And we'll see how that changes as we update the output. I think there was an extra bracket there, so let's save that. So right now it's false, and then it goes to true once we're over. So this is tracking on the horizontal axis, and we haven't done the vertical axis yet. So we see that it goes to true when it's over. So let's also update the color of style and color for it. And we'll set that to different colors depending on if it's over top or not. So setting the color, and here we can just have a check for O3, which is going to be a Boolean value. And using a ternary operator, we can set the two different colors. So if it's over top or if it's not. So right now, if it's not, it's red. And if it's on top, it'll go green. And I'll just update these to be the age. And I can also set that for the output 3 or output 4. So the only difference between the output 4 and the output 3 is going to be that we're actually doing the calculation where we're adding in, and this is going to be the far corner. So this calculation here is checking to see the far corner of box 1 as we hover over it. I'm going to remove out the padding, so there's not as much padding between it. And now let's add in the horizontal values or the vertical values. So we'll create a couple more outputs. So that can be output 5 and output 6. So content 5 and content 6. And now we want to check, just as we did with the horizontal, we want to put that into the formula for checking to see the vertical positions of the elements. So let's add that now in. We'll select for output 4 and then put it into the formula where we've got the value of the game x1, and this should actually be y1, is checking to see if the value of the y2 plus the height 2 is less than. So if those corners aren't matching, and the other parameter that we're looking for is going to be looking to see if the y1 plus the height of 1 is going to be greater than the value of y2. So that's just setting the value for O2. And then let's set some colors for these. So this will be 5 and 6. And this will be dependent on what we have for O4. So right now it's green because it was over top vertically. And then we go underneath and it goes back to being red when there's no collision being detected. And actually I'm going to update these to be black. So that's only going to go green when we're on top. So these are just black whenever we've got a collision detected. You can see it goes green for the background color. So now let's update the outputs of these elements. We'll put it into the formula that we have. And this time we'll do it the opposite way, where we'll update the output 5 inner HTML and set that to using the backticks. And we'll add in the values. So to bring in the values into it. And this is just going to populate them into the formula that we can see the values in real time being output. And that should work. So that should add in all of the values to be output. Let's just make sure that they are updating. So it does go green whenever we've got overlap of the elements, and then black whenever there's no overlap. And so this is going to be on the vertical axis. And we can do the same for the output 6 as we did with the output 4, where we'll actually do the calculation for the element. So instead of having it separate, we're going to do the calculation so that we can see the calculated values of that far corner for the output. And let's get rid of the semicolon. We don't need that. And save. So there we've got currently the vertical, and we should also output this value, so whether it's true or false. And even though we have the color changing, this will give us a better indication of if we've got a collision happening. So there we go. So we've got all of the numbers on screen, and as we're moving it on the screen, we can get a better sense for whenever we've got a collision. So right now, both horizontal and vertical, there's no collision detected. Let's move the box up. That gives us a vertical detection. Let's move box 2 down. So while it's overlapping vertically, so let's cross there, we're getting it going green. And then once it's no longer overlapping, it goes back to being black. And now on the horizontal, whenever there's overlap between the elements, they're going green, it's going true. And the same thing, so it doesn't matter which box we're moving, whatever the coordinate values are, whenever the overlap is detected, that's when we're going to be having and being able to detect the collision. So now that we've got the formula for the collision detection, let's put that within a function. And this will just return back a Boolean value that's going to be true or false, whether a collision has occurred. So the collision, and we're going to get the item number 1. So this is going to be element 1, and then we've got element 2. So in order to detect the collision, we need to work out what the parameters are of each one of the elements. And over here we have it within the game formula. And in order to simplify, we can just get the current element position. And we can do that using the bounding client rectangle of the elements. So let's get the first element, and that will be from element 1, and get bounding. So this way you don't actually have to track the X and the Y, and then you can just use the get bounding client rectangle value, which will return back the dimensions of the element. So that will automatically pull that information in. And what that's going to look like within the console is if we enter in box number 1, we can get the get bounding client rectangle, and I'll open that up a little bit larger. So that gives us the X, the Y, so it gives us an object where we've got the left, the right, the top, the width, the X, and the Y. So we need all of these in order to make the calculation where we've got the X, Y, and width and height values. And so those are the same values that we're tracking, and now we can just get those out of the object A. And we'll do that for object B. So this is going to determine where the position of the element is in real time, returning back the object. And I'm going to output that into the console. So that way, whenever we make a move, and we can do a collision detection check, and that will return back a value, and passing in the element 1 and element 2. So these can be then any element that we can pass in and get the collision position. So we don't have to be tracking them, and this is going to make it more flexible if we add any additional elements to the page, and if we don't happen to have the height and the width, we can then determine it depending on the position. I'm also going to add in one other option here within the output 7. So this is going to be an area where we can output content. So call it content 7. And this is where we can detect if there's a collision. So we'll output the results using the variable output 7 and then the inner HTML of the element. And for now, we'll just output the result of the collision. So the hit value, and this is going to be coming back from the value 1 returned back from the collision. So right now we're not going to have anything being returned back, so it's just being returned back as undefined. So let's update this formula where we're checking to see if there is a collision occurring. So it's going to return back a value of true if the collision occurs. So let's calculate that out. And I'll call it temp for now while we're doing the calculation. And then we'll return back the value of temp. And then we'll clean up the code after we've done the calculation. So right now the value of temp is not going to be returning anything. And we want to get those object values for those elements from the screen. So let's make the calculation where we'll get the value of A, X, and check to see if the value of Y, X, plus Y width, and we'll wrap that into, and we'll bracket around this. And this actually should be B, as it's contained within the B element. So right now we've got a hit of true, and then it's going false, as we're only tracking the content to the left of the last part of box number 2. So we want to add in the second part of the formula, where we're also checking to see, so that can be using the and then the rounded brackets in order to separate it. And this is where we're going to be checking to see AX plus a width is going to be greater than BX position. So again, that same formula that we just used, and it's just outputting it again. So checking to see, and that should be property value. So A width. And let's just add in the other bracket for this. So right now we've got hit as false. So hit is only true whenever we're on top of the element. So as soon as the boxes are no longer matching on the horizontal, the hit goes to false. So we also want to track on the vertical. So that's going to be the temp X, and then this is going to be the temp Y. And we then can combine these two calculations. So let's work out according to the formula that we have, and we'll return back the value of temp Y. So right now temp Y isn't going to have any content in it. We'll take the value of A, Y, and check to see if it's less than the value of B, Y plus B height value, and wrap that within our rounded bracket. So right now we're coming as true, and then it goes to false when we move off of where the position of the boxes are. And right now we're only tracking if it's less than the last part of it. So that's where we're going to true there. So let's update this and add in the second part of the condition, and that's going to be checking to see if the value of a y plus the a height is greater than the value of b y position. And I'll wrap this within the rounded brackets. So again, a little bit easier to read. So now we should have a full y value collision. So it's going to true whenever the y axes are on top of each other. So that's just being tracked within that last part there. I'll make this bigger so that's a little bit easier to see. So give it a class of output 2. And this can have a large font size. And let's set that to 1 point, or set it to 2 EM. It'll be super big there. And add that in to the element as we're creating it. So set that as output 2. So hit right now is true. And right now what we're doing is we're tracking only on the y axis. And we see the changes that are being represented. We can also update the color of that element so it stands out a little bit more when we do have a hit on top. So this is being returned back as a Boolean value. So just as we did before, where we're setting the style color of the element, we can set that using the ternary operator, and that's going to be using the value of val2. So if we do have a hit, it can go to red, and if there's no hit, then it'll just stay as black. So right now it's overlapping, and whenever it's not overlapping, we're getting that value. So let's do a combination of both of those, and we'll simply return that back. So we're not going to use the value of tempx. I'm going to leave it within the example, and you won't need to use it. And what I'm doing is I'm just combining both of these into one response, and then eventually you can comment out all of this because it's not going to be needed within the question of the collision. So now we're only going to go red whenever the collision is occurring. So tracking all of that information, and we can see the calculations in real time for whenever the hit detection is checked. So whenever one box is over the other box, and this is the formula that you can use in order to detect which axes are overlapping on the two different elements. So now we can even add in a third element onto the screen. And this one doesn't actually need to be tracked because this one will work as well, the collision detection, when we can collect and check to see if there's a collision between other boxes. So let's create the third element. And I'll call this one box 3. So maybe we want to have this as a center box and add it to the game board. This one can also be a div. So set this up as a div. And I'll just write a void in it. And this one can have a class of, and I'll call it blocker. So that will allow us to distinguish between the two. And now let's apply some styling to the blocker element, setting up a width of it of 200 pix. Left position is going to be 100 pix. Top, also 100 pix. Position is going to be absolute. And then the height can be 100 pix. And we'll check to see if there's a collision on this element. Let's add a background color for it. So set that up as yellow. So there's our element, and we can do a text align, make it look a little bit better. Center align. There's also the line height so that we can vertically align. There we've got our content, and let's also make the font size super big as well. So set that up, and we can say 4 EM. So we definitely want to avoid that yellow square. And let's go back, and we'll create another information area. So this will be output 8, and this will be tracking for content 8 and whatever we've got for the element. And we'll also make this one have large content to output. And then where we've got the collision detection set up, we can now pass in on box number 1 and box number 3, update the 8 and 8, and we'll set up a couple values for this. And box number 2. So depending on which box is over top, we can set and update the color of the element for element number 8. So if val2 is going to be on top, we'll set it to red and black if it's not. And then for number 9, and if val3 is on top, we'll set it to blue and black if it's not. And actually that should be 8 as well. So that's checking to see if both of them are hit. So hit box 1, center, hit. Box number 1 is going to be returning back a Boolean value. And then we can also add in for box number 2. So box number 2, and I'll also make this, I'll make this smaller as we don't need it to be that big. So just bring it back to output 1. So right now they're both false. So box number 1 has gone to true. Box number 2 is true. And the reason that box number 1 isn't making it go red, so what we want to do is also where we've positioned the element. So we've added it afterwards. So if we want to add it to the page before the other elements, that will change the Z index so that these elements now can be on top of the element. And I also want to update, so how about we update the color of box number 3. So box 3, and we'll just set it to be blank. So if either one of these are true, and let's set the background. So this will have the effect of updating the center box whenever there's a collision detected on any one of the boxes. So the reason it's not working for red is that we want to be able to check to see. So only if the val2 is not there, then we'll update it to blue. So that way we can change it with the red. And then once the red box leaves, that will update the color. And if none of the boxes are collision, then it'll just be the default yellow color. So that's how we can make some updates to the elements and detect collision. So from now we can just use this one function in order to do the collision detection on all of the elements.